Holy Gospel according to Matthew. Jesus was led up by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. He fasted 40 days and 40 nights, and afterwards he was famished. The tempter came and said to him, "If you are the Son of God, command these stones to become loaves of bread." But he answered, "It is written, one does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God." Then the devil took him to the holy city and placed him on the pinnacle of the temple, saying to him, "If you are the Son of God, throw yourself down, for it is written, he will command his angels concerning you, and on their hands they will bear you up so that you will not dash your foot against a stone." Jesus said to him, "Again, it is written, do not put the Lord your God to the test." Again, the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their splendor. And he said to him, "All these I will give you if you will fall down and worship me." Jesus said to him, "Away with you, Satan, for it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve only him." Then the devil left him, and suddenly angels came and waited on him. The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. We human beings have an insatiable desire to understand why things are the way they are. If you've ever spent much time with a young child, maybe you've experienced the onslaught of questions. Why is dirt dirty? Why aren't there any more dinosaurs? Why do people get sick? Why do I have to go to bed so early? The story we heard in our first lesson of Adam and Eve in Genesis addresses on many levels why certain things are the way they are, such as explains why people hate snakes and why women experience pain in childbirth. In the section we heard in our first lesson, God puts Adam in the Garden of Eden as its watchkeeper and servant. He then tells him that he may eat freely of all the trees in the garden but one. Now, if you ever had any teenagers or are a teenager yourself, I think you probably know what's going to happen. And matter of fact, this action may even happen as early as age 2. It happens when we're told not to do something. There's something about a prohibition that makes it more desirable. By the time we get to the second part of today's story, Eve had been created, and then they were told that the two of them at that time were naked but were not ashamed. And I think this very verse that precedes the passage then that picks up is an important point, because as our passage concludes, it says that they saw that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together to make loincloths. Something had changed. By eating the fruit of the tree of knowledge, Adam and Eve were changed. So again, this story is about our human condition and why things are the way they are. And we can read scores of commentaries and books on theology that refer to this story of Adam and Eve as the fall. when the idyllic Eden was lost through sin and disobedience. But I want us to set aside that idea of it being a fall this morning and contemplate ways that this story seeks to convey why things are the way they are. It might help to just give it a different title, like Reaching for More, or The Day Their Eyes Were Opened, or The Origin of Shame. I see this story as capturing an advancement in our evolutionary history, which probably took many thousand or even millions of years as our brains developed the capacity for ethical decision-making. After they ate, their eyes were opened. They could now discern between good and evil. This was the beginning of the dualistic mind. Now they could divide the world into up, down, on, off, enemy, ally, good, evil. This ability to make judgments between what's good and bad not only made them like God, but also greatly complicated their relationship with God. The trajectory of this story, it just seems inevitable. They do what they were told not to do, and they end up more separated from their divine creator. All too often, this story's been used by patriarchal society to fault Eve for her role and thus justify the subordination of women. But what if we see Eve here as the one who's really reaching for something more? She's the leader here, bringing Adam along with her. Psychotherapist and rabbi Tirzah Firestone asks, is it pride or a desire for consciousness that drives Eve to the inevitable? She picks the fruit, tastes it, and passes it on to her husband. And it's only after both of them have eaten from the tree of knowledge that the world's polarities of good and evil, mortal and immortal, self and other, even begin to exist. Tirzah goes on to say that this Hebrew creation story is a template of the psychological and spiritual development shared by us all. So perhaps it's not so much the story of a woeful fall, but the story of the birth of the ego, necessary for the work of consciousness to begin. Some might even say it's a story of young childhood development, describing the emergence of a child from pre-conscious oneness to separate individualism. I believe it reveals much about why we are the way we are, and how throughout our lives we often make choices that take us farther and farther away from our primal innocence and connection with the divine source of our being. I'm also fascinated by some other dynamics in this story. Like, who actually tells the truth in this story? God or that crafty serpent? The serpent seems to be the better truth teller. God, if you remember, says that the day you eat of the fruit of the tree of good and evil, you will die. Well, the serpent shows up and enters into a dialogue with Eve, first asking if God said not to eat from any tree in the garden. And Eve puts him straight, says, well, they can eat of the fruit of all the trees in the garden, but not the one in the middle, or they will die. And then for some reason, she adds a prohibition that God didn't include, to not even touch it. The serpent then speaks the truth, saying that they won't die, but will become like God or like the gods, knowing the difference between good and evil. And when Eve looked and saw that this fruit was a delight to the eyes and could bring wisdom, she reached out, took it, ate it, and gave some to her husband. We humans, created in God's image, would naturally want to be like God. We have been given free will, which opens the door to our disobedience and ends up getting us kicked out of the garden. It's interesting to me to see the many twists and turns that some biblical commentators will go to keep God from being seen as a liar here, when the story kind of seems to lean that way. Some have even conjured that, well, one day is like 1,000 years to God, so Adam and Eve really did die the same day they ate it. Others assume that they would have lived forever if they had never eaten of the fruit, so it just means that they were doomed to die. But this story, like any other good story, is really open-ended. It doesn't answer all the questions that we can bring to it. Adam and Eve ate, and their eyes were opened. As they gained the knowledge and ability to make distinctions, they also, though, lost that sense of connectedness, oneness with God, who used to walk with them in the garden. Does this aspect of the story connect to any part of your story? There were a few years in my late adolescence and early adulthood when the abstract thinking abilities of my brain exploded, as they do as part of natural development. And I wondered whether or not God truly existed. I self-identified during that time as agnostic, just not knowing. I learned about good and evil more from the choices I made in life, some good, some bad. There was a time in my life when I ate of the same fruit that Eve and Adam ate. I had been brought up in the garden of a loving, caring Lutheran congregation and a loving family. But as I ate of the fruit, I too hid from God, hid from other connections as well. Eventually, I heard God's call to come back home, and I began a new leg in my spiritual journey. And you know, the season of Lent is a time for renewing our connection with God. It's a time to acknowledge all the ways that we've eaten that fruit and turned away from loving God and neighbor. All the choices that we've made that take us farther away from God. Lent is a time to ponder who we are and who God has created us to be. It's a time to ponder why we are the way we are. And so you're invited to join others on a venture on Tuesday nights via Zoom as we explore the Enneagram as a tool for spiritual growth. It's a tool to help us discover more why we are the way we are. Many spiritual guides speak about a second naivete or second innocence as part of one's spiritual journey. And I sense this is maybe a little bit of what Jesus means when he says you must become like a little child to enter God's kingdom. I think it also means getting beyond our forever judging things as good and evil, going back in some way to before we took a bite of the fruit, to recognize our interconnectedness with all things. There's a familiar story from the Taoist tradition that illustrates this mindset of not judging things as either good or bad. An old farmer had worked his crops for many years. One day his horse ran away, and upon hearing this news, his neighbors came to visit. "Oh, such bad luck," they said sympathetically. "Maybe," the farmer said. The next morning, the horse returned, bringing with it 3 other wild horses. "How wonderful," the neighbors exclaimed. "Maybe," replied the old man. The following day, his son tried to ride one of those untamed horses and was thrown and broke his leg. The neighbors again came to offer their sympathy on his misfortune. "Maybe," answered the farmer. The next day, military officials came to their village to draft young men into the army. Seeing that the son's leg was broken, they passed him by. The neighbors congratulated the farmer again on how well things had turned out for him. "Maybe," said the farmer. Accepting whatever happens in our lives, free of judging it as either good or bad, is a trait of this second innocence. It's a step in the right direction to finding our way back to the garden. This story of Adam and Eve can function like a mirror for us. We see ourselves in both Adam and Eve, and they're called to tend and watch over a particular garden in communion with their Creator, we see that, like them, we don't always follow God's desire for us to be in unity, to see no strangers, and to love our neighbors as ourselves. We've eaten the fruit. Our eyes, too, are now open to good and evil. How might we best use these powers of ethical judgment in obedience rather than disobedience? I think it's insightful to make a connection between this story of Adam and Eve and today's gospel. Adam and Eve ate and gained that ability to distinguish between good and evil. In the desert, tempted by the devil, Jesus uses this same ability to distinguish between good and evil in order to resist the tempter. The cunning tempter tries to separate him from his sense of oneness with God and misuse his identity and power. Jesus seems to have gained the primal oneness that Adam and Eve somehow there lost. He stays connected and responds to each temptation by quoting Scripture. They are told that they would die when they ate the fruit of the tree of knowledge, and they were expelled from the garden. Jesus, however, died on a tree, and 3 days later emerged from the tomb in a garden. The more I reflect on this story of Adam and Eve, the more I'm convinced that it wouldn't have been much of a story if they had never tasted that forbidden fruit. Once the prohibition was in place, it just seemed inevitable. Again, it reveals why things are the way they are. And it's up to us whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. So I encourage you to take this story with you on the remaining 36 days of our Lenten journey. And let's take some time for self-examination, asking, where have our choices resulted in creating distance from God? Where have we fallen short in caring for creation and loving our neighbors? It's helpful to engage some kind of meditative prayer practice that can regulate our naturally dualistic judging minds and enhance our underlying experience of oneness with God. And maybe someday, we'll find our way all the way back to the garden. Amen.